starting the webinar now. So hello again, everybody. Delighted to see you all back again for this second session today in the Integrity at Work online conference. This is our 6th of 8 sessions that we're running. We'll have 2 more sessions tomorrow. And I hope that you have been able to join us for some of the sessions at least already. For those of you who I haven't met already, my name is Stephanie Casey and I am the Integrity at Work Programme Manager. So just a reminder, as always, that all of the sessions this week are in the information pack, which we have sent to you. You will see it in the emails that you've received from my colleague James. That's a OneDrive folder that we've set up with links to materials for these sessions and the full agenda and recordings of the sessions as well. So if there's anything that you've missed so far, the recordings of all the sessions that have happened up until now are in there. And this session will also be added if you have to jump off for some reason. But we hope you don't and you can stay with us for this lunchtime session. All of the information on the conference is on our website, integrityatwork.ie, as are the biographies of all of the speakers and the full agenda. So do jump into the website at any stage if you just want to follow up or receive any more information on the sessions this week or indeed on the Integrity at Work programme. Do follow us also on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Quite apart from the conference this week, we also regularly post on training and events and information that we feel would be of use to the organisations that are both members and non-members of the initiative. So do please follow us on those 2 platforms if you're on social media. And as always with these sessions, right through this week, we want the sessions to be as useful and productive for you as possible. So we do encourage you to ask us any questions that you might have by using the Q&A button that you can see in your panel there or on your screen. So ask us questions at any stage and we will dedicate some time at the end of the session to come to those questions. So I'd like to thank our sponsors for the conference, Whistleblower Software and EQS Group. Okay, so I think we have a good number of people with us now, so I'm going to move to the panel discussion. And we're delighted to have a great panel of speakers with us today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to the facilitator for this session, Andrew Breakwell. Andrew is Commercial Director of UK, Ireland and Netherlands in EQS. Andrew has been supporting compliance, ethics and risk professionals internationally for over 25 years, with a particular focus on integrated risk management and compliance software solutions, as well as associated consulting and advisory services. Prior to this, Andrew was involved in the corporate training and educational publishing sectors. So Andrew, I'm delighted to hand over to you to kick off this lunchtime session and to introduce our speakers today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks also for inviting me to facilitate today's discussion. It looks like a really interesting hour or so, so I hope people who are participating get value from it and enjoy it. And I'm personally looking forward to hearing what all our panelists have to say. So as Stephanie mentioned, in this session, we focus on values at work and we're calling it rules beyond rules-based compliance. And we'll be exploring the need for companies to move away from a purely rules-based approach to compliance, relying on their policies and procedures to tell employees how to behave, to driving an ethical or compliance culture within the organization. Stephanie's introduced me already, so I won't repeat what she said about me personally, but EQS Group, just by way of introduction, we're a provider of a range of digital compliance solutions to international organizations to help them meet their compliance regulatory responsibilities, including our Integrity Line whistleblowing platform. And I'm really pleased today to be able to be joined by three experts on the panel, and I'm going to hand over to them to introduce themselves. So Lisa, perhaps we can start with you first.
Sure, thank you. So I am Lisa Randalls. I work for Good Corporation. We're a management consultancy that specializes in business ethics programs for companies and organizations. We help organizations to build and benchmark their compliance programs. And we do a lot of work in the areas of codes of conduct, speak up, anti-bribery and corruption, human rights, and increasingly ESG, which covers all of these and more. We also do a lot of work around ethical culture in organizations. So we'll be talking a bit about that today. My personal background's in communications. I spent about 10 years working at a global PR firm, working with mainly large organizations and some not-for-profit organizations, and then another 10 years working in-house on both internal and external communications before I moved into compliance.
Thanks, Lisa. Paul?
Thank you. I'm Paul Hulshoff. I'm leading KPMG's advisory practice on integrity and compliance in the Netherlands. We are with a team of 35 professionals helping all kinds of organizations in all kinds of sectors worldwide on assessing and improving their ethical culture. I have a personal background in law school and criminology, so I know how policies and procedures could work if you bear in mind how people react and how people's psychology work. And, that's what I try to bring to clients as well.
Thank you, Paul. Last but not least, Tilly.
Yeah, I'm Tilly Pryor. I work in Transparency International UK in our business integrity team. And I have been responsible for leading on our research on measuring effectiveness, our approaches to values, and raising corporate anti-corruption disclosure standards in recent years.
Thanks, Tilly. So as you can see, we've got quite a diverse mix of experiences on the panel today. So just before we start our discussion, I'd just like to remind you of what Stephanie said. We'd like this to be an interactive session. We'd encourage you to enter questions in the Q&A box that you'll see on your screens. And we've allowed time at the end of the discussion to answer any questions you submit. So as they come to you, as we go through, please enter them in. So I'm conscious of time. So let's move on to the discussion itself. So our discussion today draws from the recently published Values Added report produced by Transparency International. And I know, Tilly, that you were very actively involved in producing this report. So perhaps I could start off by asking you to provide some background to the report, and why values became a priority or area of focus for you.
Yeah, of course. So I think it became a priority area for us to research a bit deeper, because in our previous sort of consultations with companies, it was an area that kept on coming up. Companies were continuously asking us how they could sort of move away from that rules-based approach. I feel cases like Airbus, Glencore, which specifically drew attention to issues of culture and rules not being sufficient to deter corrupt behaviour, really brought it home that there was something that needed to be done, and that relying on rules was no longer sufficient to curb the corruption. I think we in TI UK felt that we weren't trying to sort of move away from anti-bribery rules. They were really it was more how you could build on those policies and procedures to build in values. So things such as employee code of conduct procedures, all of that was still sort of at the heart of it. It was more how you could strengthen your anti-corruption programs through values, and looking at how corporate values and ethics alongside compliance programs could help promote an organizational culture of integrity and compliance. And I think that's where we sort of were hearing from companies, that's what they were wanting to get to. So I think we really sort of wanted to dive into it a little bit deeper, because values sometimes, if they aren't done well, can be a little bit like window dressing. So we really wanted to look into how you could properly embed values to make what you had in place already work better, I think is what we were trying to get to with the new report.
And just to expand on that, why do you think it's important to take a holistic view when looking at cultural values?
I think what we found was at the start of our consultation, we were hearing a lot that people were wanting to move away from rules and wanting to sort of take a values-based approach. And I think for us, we found that actually it wasn't a binary or mutually exclusive choice. It was more a feeling of emphasis. So you were often doing the same things, it was just you were maybe approaching them differently. So you would still be doing your training, you would still be creating policies and procedures. It was just perhaps the way that they were written or the way you approached them would be different. And it's so important to take a holistic view, because it really needs to be incorporated throughout the employee journey. So everyone needs to buy into it. Everyone needs to sort of almost own those values. So from the start of joining, so in the hiring, all the way through to the training, appraisal process. So it needs to be holistic, because a number of different areas within the organisation will have to be involved for it to work in the way that people are wanting it to sort of enhance that programme.
And just out of interest, who did you reach out to? Who participated in the survey? Who informed the report?
Yes, so for the survey, we mostly spoke to FTSE 250 companies, government agencies and academics. I think there was quite a lot of work being done with business students and university sort of departments. So we spoke to all three kind of those sectors, and we got a real range of input, which was really interesting. But I think what we found was everyone was coming back to that enhancement rather than changing of sort of starting again. It was just, right, how can we approach things differently?
And I think perhaps somebody can post in the chat a link where participants can download the report so they can read it in full. Paul, what are your thoughts on what Tilly's said and on the report?
Yeah, I believe it's always a very interesting discussion. On the one hand, you have values, on the other hand, rules. I believe it's about a connection between those two. So rules and policies, procedures can be effective in isolation. I think that values can even be more effective in isolation, but the most effective is having values, then policies, rules, procedures in this order. Because for people to understand what they need to do, they can rely also on the reason behind certain policies, and therefore values are key. At the same time, we are working in an environment that is extremely changing, and in particular over the past years. So we are all working hybrid, like we do in this session, for instance. It's way more complexity. People are therefore also assigned to more responsibilities. And what we find, talking to a lot of clients, is that rules and regulations are then less effective. So there is a logical shift to a more value-based approach, which does require more autonomy, In the Netherlands, looking at the governmental sector, we say we also need more a human touch in the way we set our policies. And when you dive deeper into the topic of values, that's really about your mindset and your attitude. And after that, it's helpful for people to have these translated in policies, and that basically guide a certain behavior. What we also see is, if you look to other sectors like the medical sector, there's been a lot of scientific research in hey, to what extent do rules and regulations help getting the right behavior. One example is in Israel, in medical sector. There's been an extensive research in operation rooms where you can imagine there's a high pressure, a lot of risks involved, a lot of things can go wrong. So basically what this research was focusing on is, hey, do we see a connection between, on the one hand, the amount of rules and regulations that apply to that medical surgery room, and on the other hand, what's the connection with the amount of medical mistakes being made? And the interesting part is that it turns out to be a U-curve, telling me that, to some extent, you need rules, procedures, and regulations. But there is an optimum. And after the optimum, things can go really bad, really wrong. We even found out that in over-regulated surgery rooms, the number of medical mistakes is way higher than in the ones that barely had any rules or regulations, that had indeed barely rules and regulations. And I did a lot of research into psychology, and it's quite logic. What happens with people if you overflow them, so to say, with rules and regulations, is that basically you create robots at first, so people tend to solely focus on the rules and forget about the context. Secondly, what is happening is that people feel some sort of aversion, in particular in high professional environment, and of course that's not a nice mindset, in particular not in a surgery room. And a third reason, for the more incidents when there are more rules, is also the fact that people, when overloaded with a lot of rules, create some sort of fear of making mistakes, these are all reasons why this connection between rules and let's say right behavior exists. And what we see in practice in a lot of organizations, when things go wrong, one of the first reactions is, hey, let's reevaluate the rules, probably adding some new rules. While sometimes in practice that might even work counterproductive, even creating a bigger problem than the one you're trying to solve.
That's interesting. Sorry, I've been on mute. No, that's interesting. So, I mean, it's clear that you can't rely on rules alone, but what you're saying is beyond that, having too many rules in place can actually have a negative or detrimental impact. Yeah, exactly.
So basically, you could say that rules are there to protect the values. So to make a statement, I think rules are helpful to protect your values, but first start with defining the values. And indeed, like you said, Telly, it really need to be part of the organizational culture, and it starts as of the first day when someone enters the organization, how you talk about values, how decisions are being related to certain values, how some policies are rolled out in the organization based on some of the key values, how leaders in the organization make decisions based on certain values. That is really needed to bring these values to life and basically make these effective.
So if we agree, based on what you've said, that you can't rely on rules, it's very much about developing a values approach or and affecting culture. I mean, what do we mean by that? What do you mean by risk culture within an organization, and what drives culture?
Exactly. Now, basically, when we talk about risk culture, it's really about the way people in an organization deal with all kinds of risks. It can either be operational risk, but also ethical risk, health and safety. You mentioned it. So our behavior, how we deal with it, is key. Now, what we did with one of our colleagues, Sushmuel Kaptein, he's a professor in business ethics at Rotterdam University. He did a scientific research into more than 150 ethical incidents in all kinds of organizations worldwide. And the thing that he wanted to figure out is, can I find the real root cause that explains why this incident in this particular organization happened? And by doing so, he was able to trace all the incidents back to either one of the 8 cultural dimensions that should be in place in any organization to say, hey, that there is an ethical culture. And I will shortly go through them. It's good to know that this model is widely used in organizations to assess ethical culture, also by regulators. Now, I know in Ireland, the Central Bank in Ireland, they are now also assessing risk culture, looking at the exact 8 factors. The first one of it is clarity. And so how clear are the values? So we can write these down, but the effectiveness of it depends on how do we communicate about it. We know, for instance, from communication theory, Liza, that now when people talk to each other and have discussions about it, that's way more effective than just simply sending over your set of values via email or posting these on intranet. The second element of it is role modeling, and the tone at the top, echo in the middle. It's helpful if the key leaders in the organizations in words, but more importantly in behavior, prove how the values should look like in daily practice. Then you have the third element of commitment, so the intrinsic motivation of people, so the extent to which people feel respected, to what extent the personal value of people is also reflected in the organizational values. Are people actively involved in all kinds of decision making? Fourth element is really about facilitating people in doing the right thing and making sure that they have sufficient time, that the objectives and the goals are realistic, that people are also provided with the right tools, basically. Then the fifth element is really about the visibility of behavior. So do we really know what is going on in the organization? And on the reverse, do people have a sense that what they do is being watched, being seen? Is someone helping you, seeing you? Then the sixth element is about the openness to discuss all kinds of dilemmas. How normal is it for people that they admit certain mistakes that they have been making? Or how normal is it to discuss within teams all kinds of ethical dilemmas that are in place? What is needed at least is that there is some sort of invitation for these kinds of conversation and making time for it. Now, and the seventh element is a more proactive way of openness. That's really about the comfort of people to provide feedback, but also the comfort that people feel to report issues. So if I see something, will I say something? And in general, people tend to provide each other feedback on content, but when it goes about our behavior or the way we make decisions, it's way harder. And in organizations where they really have this feedback culture, people do not feel boundaries or not so much in providing those kinds of feedback as well. And then you have the last element, and that's the element of reward and enforce. Clearly, if there's clear-cut misconduct in an organization, it's helpful that an organization shows, based on the values, where do we stand for and do we sanction this appropriately? But more importantly, from a behavioral change perspective, is that we value the right behavior. So do people receive, for instance, compliments for saying no to some requests that are clear-cut against your code of conduct? And so is this really valued and being seen in an organization? And the last element of it is that in any organization, how strong your ethical culture is, there can always be something happening, or there can always be an incident happening. You cannot prevent anything from happening, but the element is do we learn from it? So do we really take the time to deep dive into the root cause to find out what happened in order to learn from it, and even better, to share these learnings across the organization? So basically these 8 elements, Andrew, define the ethical culture. And basically from a managerial point of view, you can also see it as, these are this is my steer, my 8 managerial elements I can steer my organization or my team with.
Those 8 elements are really interesting. I've noted them down, and I think it's it's a useful reference for companies to have when looking at values and culture within the organization. So if they implement or take account of those 8 elements, what benefits will they get in your experience?
First of all, the better these 8 elements are part of your organizational culture, the less instance there is that things go wrong. So we can prove that the number of ethical incidents is way less in organizations with a more mature ethical culture. But more importantly, probably, is that it also boosts happiness of people in the firm. People are proven to be way more committed to organization, work longer, work with a better vibe in ethical culture organizations. The same goes for innovation. We know that organizations who do the right thing based on clear-cut values are way more innovative in term. And we also know that, like I said, things can go wrong, of course. We cannot prevent everything, but in an organization with a solid ethical culture, there's more reporting. And of course, that's helpful. You want to know what's happening in order to be able to fix it and to make sure that it won't happen again. So I would say this is your business case to invest in it and try to further shape your ethical culture based on the values that you believe in.
Thanks, Paul. Lisa, a lot of the work you do and Good Corporation does is around sort of ethical culture within your clients and within the organizations you work with. Do you have any specific sort of feedback or comments or observations on what Paul has said? But then I want to ask you specifically about the differences between risk culture and ethical culture.
Yeah, no, I think I couldn't agree more, Paul, with everything you've just outlined. And I think when you think about the risk culture in an organization, it's not inherently an ethical culture. Different organizations will have different ways of approaching risk and managing those risks. As Paul describes it, a good risk culture will also include ethical commitments. It will include enabling and reward systems that support people within the organization and those who do business with the organizations making good ethical decisions. And that will in turn minimize the ethical risks that organization, can face. But, in my view, ethical culture very much feeds into an overall good risk culture in an organization, because the risk culture itself is much broader than just the ethics. I think in looking at ethical culture, you're looking specifically at how ethical attitudes and behaviors are in the organization. And Paul described the set of 8 drivers that he referred to. We have 10 drivers, which include those 8 really, and just kind of split hairs on how you look at those. But a couple that you didn't mention, which I will mention, is just that people are treated fairly. And, it's not just employees, but it's also customers and suppliers are treated fairly. In an organization where there isn't an emphasis on paying people on time or, putting fair arrangements in place when you're dealing with suppliers or business partners, that sets a tone in the organization for how we treat people. And you then get employees modeling, that behavior, and you end up with a less ethical culture than you do if the organization from the very top, treats people well. Tone from the top, is so important on all levels: risk culture, ethical culture. We want to be in organizations where senior management is heard to promote good ethical behavior and doing the right thing, sometimes at the expense of delivering on targets, because that happens. We want to be in organizations where management, from line managers all the way to the C-level executives, are promoting speak up, and that the board is engaged at that level as well. So I think as I said, a risk culture isn't inherently an ethical one, but what you do in terms of building ethical culture is going to feed very much into a good risk culture in an organization. And that's really important, particularly for, you know, NGOs and charities and lots of these organizations who are often dealing with very difficult, you know, ethical risks around safeguarding. You know, you're doing business in parts of the world or operating in parts of the world where governance structures are quite lax or underdeveloped. So really having a good sense of what your risks are, what your ethical approach to how you do work in these areas is, will feed into mitigating those risk areas and ensure that you can do your work better, do business better.
Thanks, Lisa. Paul, Tilly, anything to add or to what Lisa has said?
No,
Okay.
I think.
Just okay, just before we move on, just a reminder that if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask the panel, please post them in the Q&A box. Just referring back to what I was saying earlier, Stephanie's kindly posted the link to the values report where you can download that of your own view, and also the risk culture model outlined by Paul is in the conference information pack shared with you by email. And then Lisa, we can, I guess we can also share information on the model that you've outlined as well. So we'll put that in the in an email or the link so that people can access it. Tilly, I'd like to come back to you if I may. Is it possible to make the link between a company driven by positive values and them experiencing lower rates of corruption? I suppose it links back in part to some of the benefits that Paul was outlining, but what's the evidence that by doing this you reduce corruption within your organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually, one of our previous reports called Make It Count focused specifically on measuring the effectiveness of anti-corruption programs and sort of looking at how you move beyond measuring sort of your activities to measuring what the values are, but measuring the impact of those values on your employee behavior and your corruption risk. With values being such an abstract term, it is quite difficult to get back what's a kind of causal link between your value and a reduction in your corruption risk, but it's not something that should therefore be ignored. I think we have found that, you know, for the companies that we spoke to, there was quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that they had felt that there was an improvement in culture, there was an improvement in employee engagement, there was an improvement of ownership of the sort of culture that was there, so they were less likely to want to sort of go against the company values. I think we heard from one company that they had introduced a value of respect, which led to employees not interrupting people during meetings, and they found that there was a much greater increase in engagement and employee contentment at work, and it was such a simple thing. So there was lots of anecdotal evidence that we heard from companies in terms of they found that they had seen less incidents, but it's difficult to point that to the value itself. But I think some of the ways that we had heard from companies that they were measuring this impact was to often it lent on surveys, which can be I think surveys are great. Sometimes it's very much like a specific time that it's assessing, so it can be a bit static, the information, but there were companies that were doing it a bit more meaningfully, so looking at factorial surveys instead of just simple simple surveys. And it's really about talking to employees, having that open dialogue between employees and the company. I think we found that exit interviews, appraisals, workshops, they all help to sort of allow companies to understand how the values were translating into practice, rather than just keeping them as a paper sort of set of words. It was how did they actually embed themselves? What was the day-to-day impact of those values? So instead of asking what are company values, it was more about trying to understand, like, do you feel under pressure to compromise your ethical standards to get the job done? Does your manager tolerate behaviours that do not match with your so trying to not point specifically, almost like the blame game. I think we found that employees were more open when they felt that it was more of a storytelling survey rather than answer a question. I think we also heard anecdotally again that promoting sort of an ethical corporate culture helped improve speak up culture and raising concerns. If they felt more trusting of the organization, they felt that they could more effectively raise any concerns and that they would be addressed. So I think there are ways that you can. It was an area that we found companies were a little bit resistant to. I guess they didn't think that they could measure this, but there are ways that you can, and it just sometimes might take a little bit of a more concerted effort than just doing a simple survey.
So a lot of evidence to the benefits of having a positive culture within the organization, but much of that anecdotal and perhaps less about the sort of specific links. But Paul, is any of the work that KPMG does been able to identify, specific correlations between positive values and the levels of corruption that those organizations experience?
Yeah, so the examples that I referred to earlier are all based on follow-up scientific research done by multiple universities, and they found out, for instance, I don't know the exact number, but the number of incidents in organizations drops by plus 30%, for instance, that retention increases by 15%. So there is evidence of the added value, and I notice these days more and more that more and more organizations don't have to be business cased but by an external person to say, hey, it's important to invest in your culture, because the culture is so important for organizations. It gives them identity, and in particular in a society where outsiders, they more and more will ask you and ask board members, where do you stand for? Where does your organization stand for? What's your added value? Besides doing your job or making a profit, what do you bring more, and what do you do for your people, for your clients, the things, Lisa, that you are referring for. And of course, it sometimes helps that you have these external press factors, there's raising awareness for these topics, like incidents, now ESG, and all the legislation around it. But at the same time, I believe, when you truly talk about the values-based organization, it needs to come from the inside. It's true belief, that we as an organization want to operate based on these values, and as an employee and as a client, you will see this, you will feel this, you will experience this, because we make certain decisions referring back again to certain values that we truly believe in. It's proved once and again by many organizations that the ones that do this in the right way outperform other organizations on different elements.
There are some organizations that I've come across that I would say pay lip service to this. So they publish their values, they distribute them, they do surveys, as Tilly was describing, but it almost seems a bit like a tick box exercise. So Tilly, perhaps I could come back to you. And how do organizations truly embed these values within their organization? And Paul and Lisa, I might also ask you to comment, so that they're actually driving meaningful behavioral change rather than just putting a thin veneer of this on the top of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such an important point. We did speak to a number of organizations, and you can hear the difference between the companies that sort of have the values, because you've got to have values. They can say, yeah, we've got this, and then the organizations that are really trying to see how they can use values to create a culture that is driving the right behaviors and is really investing in that culture. I think one of the companies we spoke to who had taken a very, very concerted effort to focus on values was Novartis. They had really spent a lot of time and effort looking into what they could be doing to help that employee engagement, and also making sure that it wasn't just the tone from the top, but it was actions. How were their leaders actually sort of modeling those behaviors that they were trying to achieve? So I think in terms of embedding, it's important that values need to be owned and understood by the whole organization. So that is that tone from the top, tone from the middle. Management need to encourage values, not just by words, but by actions. A way that you can sort of make sure that those values are owned and understood by everyone is consultation with your employees during any sort of values creation, any kind of discussion on values. So it makes the employees feel that these are their values. They're not being told how to think by above. You know, you need to make sure that those values do resonate with the entirety of your organization, and those values represent their day-to-day working life. So how do those values actually translate into making their decisions and things? So that it's all about, it's just constant communication and that ownership from everyone. So consultation. I think one of the, I mean, it's such a simple thing, but it really does make a difference, is just highlighting ethical behavior. It's a good way to incentivize employees to use values, and also it helps to sort of make that culture feel more tangible and achievable, and that this is how we operate. So yes, if it's refusing business because of a value, or just if there is like that company I mentioned before, having a culture of respect, not interrupting during meetings, you know, it's those simple things where you actually are living your values. Training is often a way that the companies we spoke to were sort of anchoring those values to day-to-day operations. So it helped to embed the values into the reality of the company. But to do that, you need to make sure that your training is up to scratch. So you need to make sure that your training is addressing day-to-day scenarios and is not just running through a policy. So it's sort of almost by having maybe more of a values-based training will help to embed that value. So it's just throughout the organization, it's that constant communication. And then, like I mentioned before, it's making sure it's in that entire employee journey. So signaling corporate values in recruiting materials, designing interview questions around your values will help any potential employees to recognize kind of the role that values plays in the organization and what the company stands for. So that is, I think, just making sure that everyone sort of who's there is buying into this culture is what really helps to embed it. And then again, it's like I said, the speak up culture. If you're feeling like that is working, that's going to make employees feel like there's a culture of trust throughout the organization. For that anti-corruption program to work, there does need to be this open culture, which employees are encouraged to not just do the right thing, but challenge management on issues, or think if there's anything that they see as wrong and speak up about, without fear of repercussions. We spoke to a few people from the aviation and health and safety sector, because there's really a culture of openness and learning in those sectors that we thought we saw was a really valuable way of making sure values were embedded. It wasn't there wasn't a blame if something went wrong. It was, okay, what happened, what really happened, how can we learn, what needs to change, and that created a better sort of trust culture that was there, which again then improved that connection between your work and values.
Thanks, Tilly. And Paula, Lisa, do you have sort of experience with the other clients and organizations you work with of some other additional practical steps that they can take to really embed culture within their organizations? Perhaps Paul first.
Yeah, sure. And I think Tilly and nicely framed that, because when you were talking, I thought, yeah, you tick basically all the 8 elements of the culture. Yeah, you put the values in, and via those 8 elements, yeah, you bring them to life. So clarity requires communication, role modeling requires tone at top, and decisions being made based on values. But to get back to your concrete question, Andrew, yeah, I know organizations that do, for instance, integrity walks. So they go uninvited to departments, locations, and talk with people about all kinds of ethical issues that they can face in their work. And they have the position not to tell them what to do, but to truly understand what they are struggling with, in which situation. So yeah, basically you show that this is an important topic as a role model, as a leader in the organization. But it also shows you the sincere interest into, hey, what are our people struggling with on a day-to-day business? So it also bridges the gap between leaders and the rest of the organization. Another practical thing that other organizations do is, yeah, during key meetings, they place a black swan in front of one person in a meeting. And yeah, it's every time another person who has the role to play the black swan, basically making sure that everything that is been discussed is being challenged against the values. And so that you really have the role to challenge, really practical. Everyone in this meeting can start doing that as of tomorrow. Another organization, yeah, they introduced Friday Fails competition, because they felt, hey, we feel that a lot of people want to do good, and there's such unintended pressure on improvements, but we can only do so if we know where things go wrong. We are all human beings. We all can have a bad day. We can all make mistakes, in particular in a world that's been driven by data and a lot of things coming in via your mobile phone, via your laptop, via anywhere. So they create sessions on Friday where people are given the stage to storytell about things that went wrong. And of course, in order to make this work, leaders should do, or maybe start even climbing the stage and showing the rest of the organization, it happens to us as well. Other organizations, they believe truly in transparency. So everybody is allowed to see what is going on, what we discuss. So what they do is they invite employees to board meetings. And again here, it's a very simple measure, but so effective, because it at first it boosts the quality of the meeting, because as in every group, there are dynamics also on board level that can be stuck. And if you invite someone else with a totally different perspective, you will get a different way of discussing issues. And at the same time, employees do know what is being discussed, how it's being discussed, and it also shows, I believe, trust. We have nothing to hide. Please come and see, learn. We are valuing your input. Another organization deployed a dilemma app. So every 2 weeks, all employees do get a push notification on their app with an ethical dilemma that they can respond to. And in order to do so, you learn how people in your organization look at a certain dilemma. And it's totally fine that there are differences, but it makes it visible. It creates a learning culture, and it also blending in the way of working. So just to mention a few examples that I came across.
There's some great ideas there. I really like them. I'm going to come back to you, Lisa, in a second, but Paul, just one final question for you on this topic. I'm guessing that leadership and effective leadership is really important in terms of instilling and supporting values. I mean, how do you see the role of leaders in this regard?
Yeah, it's key. It's of course key. So what is key for a leader, what I always advise is, make sure that everyone knows what are important values to you and why these are important, and try to communicate this as much as possible in reasons why you do things or reasons why you act in certain ways, first of all. But also, show sincere interest into people. Really show sincere interest in asking open questions. What drive your people on a daily basis? Why do they come to their job every day again to do their work? Sometimes as a leader, you also have to make, I would say, dirty hands, and I mean with that, if you stand for certain values. It means that when it comes to an infringement of a certain value, you cannot simply sit there and look at it. You have to act. And sometimes this comes with a consequence. But by doing so, you again emphasizing the importance of certain values. I think a lot of this is about communication. So really explaining to people why you do the things that you do. And also share where you are doubting about. What are your dilemmas? What is it that keeps you awake as a leader at night? I think that is really inviting for others in the organization to do the same.
Thanks, Paul. Lisa, can we come to you now? I'd like to ask you in a moment a little bit about how what we've talked about today can be used to improve the effectiveness of an organization's Speak Up program. But before we get to that, do you have any sort of feedback or additional inputs on what Tilly and Paul have shared with us?
There are a couple of thoughts I had. One was Paul talked about the Dilemma app, which is such a great idea. And then Tilly had earlier talked about kind of actually, I think, Paul, it was you were talking about how too many rules kind of paralyzes somebody's ability to even, assess the situation and make a sensible decision. And I think while sometimes organizations and compliance people in particular can get a bit stuck in training, everything's about training. Training is really important, but using the right kind of training is really important. So think about how you use your e-learning. Think about what works well in e-learning, what you need to sort of get out to the masses at a kind of high level so that everybody, generally knows the lay of the land on certain topics. But then really think about how you can use in-person training or some of the more creative options like the Dilemma app to help people with more specialized roles to work through the decisions that they have to make in the kinds of scenarios ethical scenarios that are going to come up in their work. It could be salespeople, it could be, your public affairs team, your supply chain procurement teams. Really, you need to take that to another level that can't be achieved, with just e-learning. And so I think looking at in-person training and particularly helping people to develop the skills to be able to make good decisions given different scenarios is a really important aspect of training, which will help with this. Was there anything else I was going to say about that? The only other thing I thought, just as you were saying, Tilly, about how companies you spoke to were really trying to get to grips with how to go beyond a rules-based culture is, and also to align what's actually happening in the organization with the commitments that the company is making. is that that's a challenge that we've seen with clients, is that, you know, there are certain parts of the organization that want to make big, huge commitments on, you know, what they're going to be doing on sustainability issues, on human rights. It could come, you know, on audit, I mean, whatever it is. And then there is the compliance team often who's looking at it from a very practical perspective, saying, you know, but what's realistic for us right now? And so, you know, don't be afraid as compliance people to challenge whether the organization can actually achieve what it, you know, is putting out there that it's going to do. We did a very unscientific survey on LinkedIn last week for Ethics and Compliance Week, where we asked people to say what their biggest ethics challenges were for 2023. And we had about 20% say corruption, 20% say human rights, and over 50% say greenwashing. So it's, you know, and this isn't just about environmental, this is, you know, across the entire sort of social governance and sustainability board. So I think, you know, making sure that what you're doing, that your processes work, that what you're actually doing in the organization aligns with the commitments you're making is important.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm conscious of time, so this is probably this last question for you is the last of the formal questions. Then we've had a couple of questions come in from the participants, which I'd like to put to you. But just going back to what I was saying earlier, so, you know, how can what we've discussed today be used to improve the effectiveness specifically of Speak Up programs, which, you know, given it's a core focus of EQS Group, is obviously close to my heart. So can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so I think we have talked about that quite a lot, but I'll just sort of reiterate some of those things. You know, the success of your Speak Up program hedges on whether your stakeholders, not just employees, but suppliers and others, trust that the organization wants to hear from them and that it will treat them fairly if they speak up. And that's going to be influenced by your ethical culture. It's going to be influenced by your risk culture. And it's going to be influenced by how effective your processes are and how clear, you know, as Paul described earlier, the processes are. So you really do need to look to inject transparency into the Speak Up process, have clear ownership at the top, and it needs to be seen to work. You need to be sharing what you're learning through the Speak Up channel and what you're doing about it, not on specific cases, but, you know, looking kind of in the whole at the types of issues that are being raised and what the organization is learning, how it's changing and improving based on that, and feeding that back to employees. And that will help with building that trust, because it's absolutely fundamental to speak up. So communications is just one lever, you know, for that, but it's an important one. And a lot of the different, you know, ideas, a lot of the creative ideas that we talked about today are very much built around the communications approach. So just a handful of ideas, you know, if we think about tone from the top, you know, put an introduction to your code of conduct from the CEO that mentions, we want you to speak up about misconduct. You know, we are fully committed to living this code in everything that we do. And if you see behavior that is not in keeping with this, we want you to speak up, and you'll be protected. And you know, we will, we're committed to confidentiality and make sure that that is heard from the top. Having a video on your website or your intranet. In fact, I've one company that I looked at a couple of weeks ago had a video that came up from the CEO talking, that it was like a talking heads introduction to the code of conduct, and it also mentioned Speak Up in there. And that's a brilliant way to make it public, to really state that commitment publicly. Sharing learnings, I talked about that. You can do that through newsletter articles. You can do that through recorded, maybe interview style, you know, chats that get put on the intranet. The annual report, the sustainability report, and that really provides reinforcement of the value the organization sees in speaking up. And then another thing that is not difficult to do, but can be really effective, is to brand your Speak Up channel. So AstraZeneca, for example, calls theirs AZ Ethics. Unilever used to have a tagline, business integrity, it's how we work. And they had a logo that was specific to that. That logo and that tagline, that slogan would appear on every poster. It would appear on all of the digital properties. It appears on the Speak Up page itself. But when you've got a logo, when you've got a brand name, it just helps with creating recognition and recall, so that whenever stakeholders see that tagline, they see that logo, they know exactly what that is, and they're reminded that it's an official channel in this organization. You know, it's something that's taken as seriously as the marketing, work that they do. And so it's an easy way to actually just draw more attention and more recognition and recall around your Speak Up channels.
Thanks, Lisa. Really useful. I think nobody amongst our participants can say we haven't given enough practical tips and suggestions for people to implement today. It's been really interesting. We've got some time. We've had a few questions come in from the participants, so I'd like to turn to those now. The first one is, do public sector government organisations or charities face any specific challenges that differ from the private sector when it comes to embedding values? Who would like to pick that one up?
Yeah, maybe the first thing that comes to my mind, interesting question, is for governmental organizations. I would say yes, it can be different because a governmental organization is a part of a bigger government. So that makes it hard to apply certain values and that are not being seen in other governmental organizations. So let's say in the private sector you have one brand and it can be identified by certain values that they roll out throughout the whole organization. I think for charity organizations the same, that should work, and I do see a lot of charity organizations that have effective value-based approach, but I can imagine for governmental organizations that it can be more challenging because there are more dependencies on other governmental institutions that, let's see, are also seen as the government, but I don't know how the others think about it.
Sure, yeah, I can touch on, I think from the governmental organizations that we spoke to, they I think there was a role, I'm just trying to remember from what they said. There was a role that, you know, they often have those core codes of conduct in place. You know, I mean, in the UK Parliament, you've got the Noble Principles, but it's actually making sure that the leaders aren't just sort of reminding that they're there, they're talking about it in their actions that are going publicly. And one person that we spoke to from a governmental organization was sort of pointing that, yes, if they have these sort of public statements on ethics and values, you've got to make sure that actually the public statements that are maybe going against the values or something don't outweigh how many times they're spoken on values. So let's say they make speeches in like a year and 2 of them reference sort of those values, but 7 reference sort of like a priority to get things done, or like to sort of talking about time pressures and something. Your values aren't going to like resonate because they're just not as common in those public speeches. So you've got to make sure that when you're looking at sort of those public communications, values are in all of them, or it's sort of evenly distributed in terms of what people are talking about, because otherwise, you know, those statements become quite meaningless if sort of not unethical, but just like other pressures are being put in front of those values.
I don't have anything, I think, more to add on that, other than, you know, just an example of a good practice. The NHS does every year a Speak Up month. And if you have time to look at what they do as part of Speak Up Month, it's actually really interesting. You know, there's a whole series that they'll release research, as part of Speak Up Month, they'll release a whole series of videos encouraging people to speak up about misconduct in the NHS. There's just a whole lot of layers to what they do as part of that kind of month-long communication around Speak Up. So while I think public sector is often much more highly regulated, you know, you've got the added factor of having personalities that affect the way that people perceive the values of an organization or an operation. There are certainly things that you can do to encourage ethical behaviors within the, you know, public sector organizations and charities. So I don't think it's, yeah, I think the challenges are there, but they're often there with large private sector organizations too.
Thanks, Lisa. And apologies, I was on mute when I asked that last question, which explains the short hesitation. I think we've got time for one final question. Maybe this will stick with you, Lisa, initially for this. So are there any specific challenges around building a good risk culture or an ethical culture in organizations that include people from a diverse set of backgrounds and national cultures?
Yeah, that's something that we often get asked, actually. And there are, because obviously different people have very different value systems, different cultures, you know, will come at a lot of these kinds of issues, whether it's conflicts of interest or human rights, you know, for that matter, from very different perspectives. So, so it is a challenge. I think a couple of suggestions. One, I would say, because this is also often asked of us, is do you have to have all of your policies, you know, and your communications around compliance translated into every language, or can you just work with your home? Yes, you do. And the other thing is, you know, if that's a challenge, if that's impossible, then it makes it more important that you really look at other ways to get the message communicated in those markets in a way that is understandable to the people who are there. So that may be having ethics champions of some variety. You know, Paul talked about integrity walks, and those are generally done by people who have had some training to, you know, they're often peers, but they just have been trained in the ethics commitments and of the organization, and in how to talk to people about them, how to answer questions, how to escalate things that people need more help on, and having those people embedded in locations where you are dealing with more challenging cultures or very different cultures to that of the headquarters can be very helpful. We have one client who's actually put together, does a lot of work in the Middle East, and they put together a whole academy, integrity academy. So they're training kind of these groups of people to just operate within their business units as kind of ambassadors for ethics, and to be able to carry out some of the training sessions that need to be done in person so that people have someone that they can talk to. They don't have anybody from legal or from head office who can be on the ground. I guess a few suggestions there.
Thank you, Lisa. Finally, just Paul, Tilly, anything to add from you on that last question of today?
No, nothing to add from my end.
Great. Good. I think we've covered all the questions. I think, can you confirm that? Yeah, can you confirm codes of conduct must be translated into all different languages that they apply to? So I think you've answered that, Lisa. So you answered it.
It's not a must, it's a should. It's not a rule.
Understood. Great. I think we've covered everything. We've covered the questions as well, and we're almost out of time. All that I think remains for me to do is to thank all of our panelists, Tilly, Paul, and Lisa, for what personally I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from this, and I'm sure we can apply some of what you've said within EQS. So I'd like to thank you for participating today. I'd like to thank all the participants for joining the event. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions or you want to contact any of the panelists directly, I'm sure they'd be very happy for you to do so. The Good Corporation report that Lisa mentioned earlier. Now there's a link in the chat, so you can download that along with the report that Tilly was referencing. So I hope you've all found today's discussion helpful. For those of you joining the other events sessions in this series of workshops, I hope you enjoy those too. Thanks all once again. Just hand back to Stephanie briefly, but thanks very much from our side.
Thanks a million, Andrew, and thanks, Paul, Tilly, and Lisa. Really interesting session. You know, what strikes me, you know, when we talk about something like values is how that conversation gets lost in just the daily grind, doesn't it? You know, everybody's so busy. Everybody's trying to get work done, particularly this time of the year. It just seems like, you know, work kind of goes into a huge fast momentum. And it's really good just to remind ourselves that organizations, employers, no matter what size, do actually need to take some time out to talk about these things and to talk about the dilemmas they're facing, or the ways of working, or the code of conduct, and have the, you know, the integrity walks, as the panel were discussing. So integrity walks and integrity talks, I suppose, is what we're talking about. So look, I'm just going to share my screen for a second, if that's okay, before we finish up, just to give you the heads up on tomorrow morning's panel. We're going to be talking about how organizations can establish effective reporting systems, focusing particularly on when reports are received, so that, you know, what are the channels that are set up, what happens when a report is received, and how it's assessed and dealt with at those early stages. So I'm going to be joined by 4 speakers tomorrow: Marie Terracol from Transparency International, Andy Watson from Oxfam, Daniel Hager from Whistleblower Software, and Rhodey Butler from the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission here in Ireland. So very broad range of experience there, from both you know, international experience and local experience. So promises to be a really interesting discussion. So look, I just want to finish off by thanking our panel again today for really interesting and really practical discussion, lots of really good ways of integrating values on a daily basis. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. And with that, I'll just draw a close to this session. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.